In this section, we're going to talk about the economic scope and purpose, and to some extent we've already referenced this slightly, but I think it's important that we get it into our notes and we make sure to cover a few of these things. To understand the difference between micro and macroeconomics. When I was growing up, I played with a little toy called a micro machine. These were like miniature versions of Hot Wheels. I realize that they are not popular now, probably were not so much when you were growing up, but that's what helps me think. Micro machines, micro is tiny, it's small. So when we think about microeconomics, it helps us deal with choices made by individual units. This is a smaller scale view of the economy. We are zoomed in on the economy looking at individual people, individual households, families, businesses, and we're not looking at the whole, the big picture. That's going to be more macroeconomics. We are looking at how individual people spend their money, the impact of how they spend their money, and how that affects the businesses surrounding them. So we might look at an individual household, or we might look at an individual business. We might even look at a community in microeconomics. And that's where we're going to spend a majority of our conversation throughout the semester we talk about economics. We'll spend most of it on microeconomics. However, it is important to understand what macro is all about, and depending upon your level of interest, you may end up taking a macroeconomics class in college. But these are going to deal with mostly large-scale economic issues. These are going to fall under the big government or global economic things. While we will reference those, we will tie those in a few times here, we are primarily going to deal with micro. But I do want you to understand what macro is all about. So national economic decisions are a big part of that. The federal budget, national inflation, even our impact on the global economy or how other economies affect the United States economy is important in macro. So it's important for you to look at both of those, have a clear understanding of the difference between micro and macroeconomics. Not that you're going to understand everything that's involved in them, but at least be able to tell the difference between the two or examples from the two. When you get into college, if you take one of those classes, they will provide a whole lot more than what we're going to have time to be able to cover in our class, but that's the main difference between those two right there. When we're looking at both micro or macroeconomics, there are a few different approaches to that. So some people will choose to look at economics in a positive economic fashion. And positive economics does not necessarily mean like all happy and warm and fuzzy inside, like just like you've recently eaten a donut. But positive economics is talking about the observation of economic systems without including any sort of human value. So it simply boils everything down to black and white. We are going to observe, and then we are going to use those observations to help us make choices. And we're not going to let our personal feelings get involved in that. We are going to predict based off of numbers and hypotheses that have been made based off of historical facts and things that we have seen in the past. Very scientific. So they're going to leave out all sort of values, opinions, personal beliefs in all of that. It's going to be simply look at the facts, make observations, then make predictions based off of those facts. On the flip side, you may also look at it from a normative perspective. Normative economics is going to also make observations, but they're going to make value judgments about the observations they're making. So those value judgments will also look at the consequence of the decisions that they're making. They may look back at historical decisions that were made and say, well, those were made right after the Great Depression, and times are different now, and we want to make sure that we are going to provide more safety nets for people, and we don't want to have anybody who is going to be affected in a negative way because we don't want people being poor and on the streets, and so we're going to include those values into the decisions that are going to be made. A lot of times the value-based economics is going to evaluate what is morally right. So when people begin to incorporate normative economics, a lot of times it can lead to people attempting to manipulate the economy for the betterment of society. Now, that's not always a bad thing, but depending upon the person's values, it could vary, and somebody may have a different set of values than somebody else, especially when we're planning the national budget. That is an example of normative economics getting into the way. Somebody may have strong feelings toward allowing Planned Parenthood and continuing funding for public funding for abortions, and that's part of their normative economic plan, while somebody else may not hold to that value, and they may say, well, that's against my belief system, and I don't believe that's right. We need to take that out of the budget. And the person arguing to keep it in the budget would say, well, now you're going to leave all these women without options, and the argument just goes on, which this is not the place for that argument, but that value is incorporated into those arguments over the economy and over the budget. And that can make things very difficult and very tricky because of the fact that we all hold to different values. And I wouldn't say that positive economics is always the right way either, because sometimes you do have to include value-based economics, and a good balance of both is important. So when we look at the value-based economics or normative economics, you've got to be careful, because sometimes we can jump to conclusions. We can say, well, everybody needs to do this. Or a few years ago, there's a big push for buy American goods. So a lot of people said, well, everybody should buy American-made goods, and if you don't buy American-made goods, then you're not a good American. And they went on all those type of tirades. Well, maybe there's a reason why somebody doesn't want to buy an American-made good. Or the other value that we've talked about a little bit is, well, everybody should tithe. Well, that's a value-based judgment. That's a normative economic approach, because while that's my personal belief that I think that God would want me to tithe part of my income back to Him, that's not necessarily going to be the case for everybody out there. And so we can't always jump to those conclusions. And the question is asked then, should normative economics control the country, or should it be more positive economic based? And that's really where the president and our Congress comes in to make a lot of decisions. And as you are choosing the people that will make those decisions, as you vote, it's important to understand their approach to many of these things.